Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Jan Macvarish. I'm the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. Tonight's event is called Trade Unions Today, Protecting Workers' Rights or Policing Workers' Speech. And this event marks the publication of our new Free Speech Union briefing document that's called Shopped Stewards, cunning pun there. Why today's trade unions police speech instead of protecting workers and how to fix it. It's been written by our research director, Freddie Attenborough, who unfortunately is not able to be here tonight. So I'm going to have to be the one who tells you what's in the report, because it's not going to be published till later in the week. But you will be able to find it on our website and read it in full then. And also, I know Toby Young was advertised as joining the panel. He's, ironically, is stuck at the House of Lords defending workers' rights in the Employment Rights Bill with his amendments, which will hopefully have an impact on minimising the policing of speech with our banter ban, attempt to challenge the banter ban. So that we'll find out, I guess, later tonight what's happened with that. So anyway, he's not going to be here. So I'm being Toby and Freddie. Luckily, in these gender fluid times, I'm well equipped to be all of those things while dressed as a 50s housewife. So it's ideal. So let me introduce our speakers. So joining us online is Paul Embery. We can see Paul in front of us, and you guys can see him behind. So Paul has very kindly written a foreword to the report, and we're going to hear from Paul first in a moment. So I'm sure you know, Paul is a firefighter, trade union activist, writer and broadcaster. He's been a member of the Labour Party since 1994 and active in the wider Labour movement for most of his adult life. He's served on the Executive Council of the Fire Brigades Union and as the national organiser of Trade Unionists Against the EU, which I'm sure is how lots of you came to hear of him. You'll probably have read him in Unheard, The Huffington Post, The Spectator, Spiked and Compact, or seen him and heard him on TV and radio. You may also have read his book, Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class, which is really excellent. And we'll go to Paul after I've introduced the speakers and just given you a brief flavour of what's in the report. Then we're going to go to Maurice Glasman, Lord Glassman. He's a Labour life peer in the House of Lords. He's widely known for establishing Blue Labour, a conservative form of socialism within the Labour Party, which encourages a return to community values based on trade unions, the church, and voluntary groups. He coined the term the lanyard class, which is why he's ideally suited to discuss the issues raised in the report, and I'll explain that in a moment. And he used that term to describe the rise of a sort of managerial layer who propagate and enforce so-called progressive values. And you'll have seen Maurice recently a lot, featuring heavily in the press, who are trying to get a grip on the current political moment, and they're turning to Maurice to help us find our way through. And then we'll hear from John Armstrong. So Dr. John Armstrong is a reader in financial mathematics at King's College London and a founder member of London University's Council for Academic Freedom, LUCAF, which is an excellent organisation. He's published on equality, diversity and inclusion initiatives in mathematics and science and in the wider university structure, and has also been known to perform lacerating critiques both of academic theoretical lunacy and woke bureaucracy, which is why we've invited him. So we're relying on him to perform. So first of all, I'm just going to quickly outline the report as best I can. So it opens with the case of one of our members who we've anonymised as TJ. And his local union officials objected to some feedback that TJ offered on a number of policies about which the membership was supposedly being consulted. Rather predictably, this included the use of gender-neutral pronouns in union policies, amongst other things. Now, for his sins, when he raised queries about some of these policies, TJ, the union member, was then subjected to offence archaeology, digging back through his social media posts, by his union comrades, And the local branch officials have reported him to management, who then proceeded to discipline him. So this kind of awful collaboration between the trade union, his local branch, and his management. And as well as this particularly egregious example of an attack by a trade union on one of its own members, the report brings together other examples which are much more well known, such as the Batley Grammar School teacher who was driven into hiding with his family after Islamic activists whipped up local protests against him and exposed his identity globally on social media. And there was zero public solidarity from the teaching unions, as I'm sure you'll remember. So although the NEU have subsequently claimed that they provided support behind the scenes, I notice, nothing was said publicly in solidarity. There were no protests in his defence, and the other teaching unions said absolutely nothing to express outrage at his treatment by his employer, who had actually caved into the mob, nor to the pressure placed on him, intolerable pressure placed on him by the mob itself. And as we all know, he's still in hiding 4 years down the line. Again, that was another extreme case, but our case bag at the Free Speech Union has got numerous examples of people who have turned to the Free Speech Union because they believe that they cannot expect protection from their own union. And we were called the Free Speech Union when Toby set it up on purpose, because he did aspire to offering that kind of protection and solidarity for people. Obviously, we're not, as a legal entity, we're not a trade union, we're a non-profit, but I think lots of the functions that we're fulfilling are actually filling a gap in what should be there in the employment sphere. So Freddie in the report then goes on to explain why the trade unions have resigned from representing their members' interests when it comes to freedom of speech in particular, and how it was the once militant British trade union movement has come to look and sound more like an Islington dinner party. You might say that it's beer and sandwiches substituted for gluten-free, possibly non-alcoholic, ethically sourced alternatives. So that's a kind of little bit of a taste of what's in the report. It's a really interesting attempt to explain how unions have transformed themselves over the recent period. Not all their own fault, not all to do with the left's politics, to do with structural changes as well. So it's worth a read when it comes out later in the week. So first of all, I'd like to come to Paul, who's sitting there. I don't know where he is. East Anglia, I think, aren't you, Paul? Norfolk.
Norwich, correct.
Norwich. So I just wanted to, Paul's going to talk us through the foreword for the report that he's written. And, I think it's fair to say that, well, do you think it's fair to say, Paul, that trade unions can no longer be relied upon to protect the free speech of their members, or is that an overly simplistic representation? What's your view?
Well, huge question, and thanks, Jan, and thanks, everybody. Thanks to the Free Speech Union for the invitation this evening. I do find it slightly funny, actually, that we're here to attending a meeting about the new political authoritarianism, and here I am looking down on you apparently like Big Brother. We'll all have to engage in our 2 minutes of hate in a minute. A good 1984 reference there. A huge political question, and I was pleased to have been asked to write the foreword for the report. And I should say, at the outset, I am a trade unionist to my core. My parents, one parent worked for a trade union, the other parent was a shop steward. Back in the day, I joined my first trade union at 16 years of age. When I became a professional firefighter, joined the Fire Brigades Union in 1997, eventually worked my way up to the executive council of that union. I've been on strike several times. I've led campaigns for union members, negotiated with employers, and so on. And I believe passionately that unions are a force for good in the workplace. That historically, when it comes to things like improving the pay and conditions of workers, health and safety of workers, decent pensions, and so on, our workplaces are better, unquestionably, for the influence of trade unions. And even now, unionised workforces, the evidence shows, are likely to enjoy better pay and conditions than non-unionised workplaces. But I think also it's very, very clear that the trade union movement has lost its way. Membership numbers have fallen sharply over recent decades. That's not entirely the fault of unions themselves. We had the Thatcher anti-trade union laws in the 1980s. We also went through the period of deep deindustrialization, which obviously had a serious impact on union figures and union density and so on. But while there are, and you touched on it, there are thousands of local reps, local workplace-based reps of trade unions who do a fantastic job, do the bread and butter stuff every day. I think the movement at the top has moved away quite sharply from mainstream workers ideologically. I think that's abundantly clear. I think the movement's leadership these days has increasingly, and it has for a number of years actually, increasingly began to embrace the dogma of what some people call radical progressivism, or wokery as some people call it. It's the same ideology essentially that I think has infected so many of our national and local institutions, our corporate institutions, educational establishments and so on. And any departure from that ideology within the movement, particularly within the upper echelons of the movement these days, is frowned upon and in some cases actively punished. And I say that from experience as someone who was kicked off the Executive Council of the Fire Brigade Union for having spoken at a pro-Brexit rally. And I think that more than ever, there is this kind of rigid groupthink that has taken hold across much of the left, and unions are not immune from that. I think on some issues it is deemed only acceptable for there to be one view is allowed. We've seen, in association with that, an upsurge in so-called cancel culture in recent years. And I think all of that has created a very profoundly unhealthy environment within the trade union movement. When you coupled also that with trade unions' kind of obsession with identity politics and DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion, and DEI particularly, I think, has become, many workers see that it's become a relentless moral lecture and is actually such a divisive creed, often pitting workers against each other in the same workplace, which is actually the very opposite of what unions should be about, which is, of course, building solidarity between workers on the basis of their common interests. So we do have workplaces that have become ideological battlegrounds. I think these days the right to freely express one's view is often subordinated to someone else's right to feel offended, and there's a very real and a very deep political and cultural authoritarianism which has taken hold in the movement and in many workplaces, and too many unions frankly have been complicit in that. We've all seen the countless stories over the recent years of certain workers being discriminated against or targeted because of their so-called unfashionable views. And unions should have been at the forefront of some of those cases, but quite often they were nowhere to be seen, at least not in terms of any serious public campaigns around them. And I think that some of those high-profile cases are, in many respects, the tip of the iceberg, because we have to ask, what about those workers? And I'm sure there are many of them who have been ill-treated or discriminated against or targeted because of their particular views, but they choose to keep silent because they don't want the trouble or the publicity, or they might not have the resources to go forward with some sort of legal claim. And I think as a result of that ideological shift, many workers nowadays simply keep their heads down out of fear for their jobs and their livelihoods. And that is not something that the trade union movement should have any part in. And I think crucially, trade unions at the moment are facing a massive battle to maintain relevance. They need to break out of their public sector comfort zone. They need to stop being the voice of the London liberal class. They need to stop turning a blind eye when workers' views are being policed to the extent that they are today. And they need to get back at doing what they were once good at. And I'll just conclude on this, Jan, that I think there are huge swathes of Britain, if you like, beyond the fashionable cities and university towns, particularly in the private sector, that are simply unrepresented by trade unions these days, and often don't even know what a trade union is. It's a world away from the years when trade unions had a big presence in private industry. Now, some people will say, well, that's because of deindustrialization. That's because we don't have those workplaces anymore, those big sort of heavy industry workplaces. But you do have the gig economy, and you do have sweatshop warehouses and call centres, and you do have thousands, possibly millions of workers in insecure employment or on 0 hours contracts and so on. So there is absolutely a case for people being represented by trade unions, and a need for people to be represented by trade unions as much as there always was. So that's my view. That's my view of where things stand in terms of the trade union movement at the moment. I pay tribute to the Free Speech Union for being an organisation that's willing to challenge the new orthodoxy. It's a battle that desperately needs to be fought and won. And I'm glad to be speaking with you about it this evening. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for taking the time to write that introduction. The one that you've written for the report, I don't mean the one you've just spoken. And so let's turn to Maurice then. The thing that I'm really interested in is what's there in the report as well, which is an attempt to kind of understand the shift that's taken place. And obviously there's lots of dynamics that have happened between shifts in the economy, shifts culturally, the kind of post-60s shift in values. And Freddie draws on Barbara and John Ehrenreich's book, or work, on the professional managerial class in the 1970s, which actually had a much more positive take on the professional managerial class, henceforth known as the PMC, suggesting that it could possibly form an alliance with workers and work together. But by the time we get to 2021, Catherine Liu wrote a book called Virtue Hoarders, the case against the professional managerial class, in which she's basically highlighting the fact that the PMC is now waging a culture war against working people, doing the work of the capitalist class in disciplining the workforce in order to consolidate its own status. So you've coined the term, Maurice, the lanyard class. Do you want to just say a bit more about what led you to call it that, and whether you think it maps directly onto the PMC, or is it something different?
Yeah, hi everybody, good evening. Yeah, the lanyard class is for me the entire managerial class that which is to oppress, stifle and police working class people in every aspect of their lives. Just to say, I also call it the progressive ruling class, and you know, it's the last thing you want to hear when you go to the doctor, isn't it? It's progressive. Just bear that in mind. As a general rule, yeah, it's a class politics, and the lanyard class, I think, PMC, you know, it sounds like a chemical company or something. I don't like acronyms. Lanyard class, they just want you to walk around work with your own face around your neck, just in case you didn't know who you were. And it's just the symbol of that kind of oppression. But before I go further, could I have 30 seconds of love, 30 seconds of hate, and then an anecdote? 30 seconds of love to Paul. Paul, it's just been a great friend for the last 10 years. Absolute love and respect to you. 30 seconds of hate, Toby Young.
It's very unfair when he's not here, Maurice.
You'll hear why it's not unfair. Every time I saw him, he said, "You've got to do this event. You've got to do this event. You've got to come to this event. You've got to do this event." And I said, "What event?" And he goes, "This event, where we are now." And I'm bunking off the Lords and missing and pissing off the whips. And then he says to me, "Oh, I can't come. I can't come because I've got to be in the Lords." So this is, everybody, my attitude. I absolutely defend his freedom of speech, and I defend my right not to listen to a word he says ever again. No, I mean, it's a deep thought, but the anecdote is really important because I think it's the genesis of my politics. So I was once an academic. I'm recovering. I'm doing okay. And I was at a university called London Guildhall, University of the City, and then that merged with another one, and we became London Metropolitan University. It was horrible, with lots of merger and discussions, and nobody did any work, so really intense discussions about how to manoeuvre it so that you did none in the future. And we were called to this 3-line whip meeting by a combination of curriculum development and human resources. You know where I'm going with this story. And we were told that in everything, I used to be lecturer in political philosophy, and we were told that in everything we did on our aims and objectives curriculum thing, we had to show an awareness of, and respect for cultural diversity, that this was obligatory on all of us. Now, I was teaching political philosophy, so I said to the guy, I said, in South Africa, there are men that think that if you rape underage girls, you get cured of AIDS. Do you respect that? And he replied to me that I had to give him some time to think that one through.
Was he a sociologist?
No, he was head of curriculum development. And then there was another guy from Human Resources who said, steady on. And I said, well, I'm not really in the mood for that. So I said to this guy, do you have girls? And he said, yeah, I've got 2 daughters. I said, and do they ever wear mini skirts? And he said, well, sometimes. And I said, well, how would you feel if they were raped and the people who raped them said they were asking for it? Do you respect that? And he also said, that's a really interesting question. Now, this is the level of public stupidity in a university, a cretinous imbecility. But the important part of the story for me was that I refused to include it on my thing, and obviously the management disciplined me. Their fantastic method of discipline they had, they refused to give me a laptop. So I said, fantastic, I don't have to do emails then. A year and a half. I'll tell you what freedom really is: delete unread. That is genuine freedom. And but to my astonishment, there was a trade union, I don't know if they still exist, UQ. What have they become now?
Yeah.
Yeah, UQ, yeah, cuckoo. And they completely took the management side. I mean, it was really, it lasted 2.5 years until they decided that they were going to give me a laptop. But the point being is that that's when I realized that the unions, the public sector unions in particular, were becoming an agent of the lanyard class, of this imposition. So what is their biggest hate? Laughter. Believe me, they don't want workers to ever laugh, and particularly mock management. That's the last conceivable thing. And because they've got no political economy, because they're all power-hungry people, they go into HR, they go into curriculum development, and they really try to exert control over what workers can say, what workers can write, what workers can think. So I just wanted to tell you, that's when I realised that I'm done with this. That's when I sort of decided that I would rather not quit university than accept this. And it was just astonishing to me the extent to which the union was even more belligerent than the management in enforcing the idea that the rape of underage girls was something to be respected. You don't need to really go further than that.
But do you think that that's more to do with the type of union you're engaged in, or do you think that those kinds of values, if they can be called values, have spread throughout the sector of trade unions, regardless of the class of members that they represent? Paul, it sounds a bit Big Brotherish, so you can mouth along with my words. Yeah, completely. This is so. Let's just look at what progressivism is. Progressive is what people who used to be socialist call themselves in order to get invited to dinner parties. So I'm progressive. As I say, I view it as an illness that rots your mind and ultimately rots your body too. It's a form of complete stupidity. Up is down, right is wrong, men are women, freedom is tyranny, socialism is coercion. And this is because the trade unions no longer have any vision of a socialist economy, of a class-based analysis. They have completely taken refuge in the enforcement of progressive values in the workplace. So what you're seeing is the complete opposite. You see trade unions becoming absolute agents of working class oppression.
I mean, that's the lanyard class theory.
So, well, let's turn to John, because, and we'll come back to Paul and Maurice. So, John, you've largely been invited because you're one half of a PMC power couple, I have to say. I hope Alice is clapping. John and Alice Sullivan, some of you will know Alice Sullivan as well, written some fantastic reports recently, which are very, very important, which she'll tell us the name of later, because I can't remember, I read it last week. But on the effect of the kind of infection of trans ideology on the collection of data and research in academia. But I don't mean to sideline you, John. But obviously you've taken a different turn. You're a refusenik of the PMC. So how's that come about? I don't mean personally, but what's it like inside? And what's your kind of take on what we're talking about tonight? You know, this kind of, is it a new class, and what kind of reach do they have?
Well, thank you very much, Jan. I think there may be a bit of wires crossed, because nobody mentioned Alice when I was invited. I was told by the Free Speech Union's head of equality, diversity and inclusion that I've been invented to make sure we had a very diverse panel.
They're actually a bot.
And so with somebody from the working class having spoken and a peer of the realms having spoken, I'm here to represent the views of the lanyard-wearing classes. Nothing about us without us. So, as John has said, I'm an academic, so I'm a fully paid-up member of the professional and managerial classes. And in 2021, my university, that's King's College London, hired a new principal, Kshitij Kapoor. And anyone who works in higher education will know that one of the highlights of the job are the inspiring messages we receive in the all-staff newsletter. And with the new principal in town, the anticipation as we awaited his weekly video message was palpable. And in his first week in the job, Kshitij met with our staff LGBTQ+ network. And in his video, he made an inspiring call to action, urging us all to support their Rainbow Lanyards campaign. This touched my heart. Yes, he may earn 9 times as much as the average staff member. But if he wore a lanyard, that meant he was one of us. Kshitij Kapoor is also chair of the UK's Free Speech and Academic Freedom Advisory Group. And in 2023, he wrote, and I'm sure you'll all agree, despite the media noise, universities generally feel that they've done a pretty good job of protecting the principles of free speech and academic freedom. Joe Grady, General Secretary of the Universities Union, UCU, was more blunt. She said in 2020 that the idea that academic freedom is under threat is a myth. This year, Sacha Roseneal, the Vice-Chancellor of Sussex, dismissed the £585,000 fine they received from the Office for Students for failing to protect Kathleen Stock's academic freedom as perpetuating the culture wars. Joe Grady wrote to the Secretary of State of Education in Sussex support, arguing that our universities are not battlegrounds for culture wars, and that framing the issues in terms of free speech serves only to silence marginalised voices. And this is precisely the problem that the FSU's excellent report is addressing. The relationship between the unions and the bosses has become far too cosy. And frankly, if you're both your boss and your union trying to silence you, you're pretty much stuffed. However, I'd like to highlight an important difference between activist talking points and corporate bullshit. Senior managers are climbing onto the EDI bandwagon because it's more cost-effective to make a few EDI gestures than to raise salaries or provide secure contracts. Union activists, on the other hand, they're true believers. So the trans policy that Sussex were fined £500,000 over, it wasn't written by the Vice-Chancellor. It was actually co-authored by union activists and Socialist Worker Party activists in 2005. And Joe Grady chooses not to recognise the erosion of academic freedom on campus for quite a principled reason, and that's because she straightforwardly opposes the free speech rights of gender-critical women. Kshitij Kapoor, on the other hand, is just simply oblivious to the erosion of free speech, and that's because he's never been cancelled personally. Now, possibly, that may be because he's never had anything interesting to say. But what really makes Eden stand out among all other institutions currently obstructing free speech is that in unions, obstructing free speech is a conscious and deliberate tactic. I was once my department's UCU rep. The last union meeting I attended was an emergency general meeting called to put forward a motion to UCU Congress that said that academic freedom should not be extended to gender-critical beliefs. I was the only person who opposed that motion, in a room full of about 30 people. And when I opened my mouth, you could see hackles visibly raise, and I enjoyed my 2 minutes of hate. Nevertheless, I'm proud to say that I defeated the motion, not because of my winning rhetoric and easy charm, but because under our branch constitution, an EGM requires 5 working days' notice. I was asked if I really insisted on this, given the strength of feeling in the room, and I decided that on reflection, yes, I did. So I agree wholeheartedly with the FSU's main recommendation in the report. I don't think anybody's said what that is yet, but it's very simple. It's that everyone should have the right to be accompanied in grievance meetings with their employer by groups such as the Free Speech Union. I can't think of a single argument against that apart from free speech being a right-wing dog whistle. Now, this can only help protect workers' rights. It's a superb idea, but there was one thing that was missing in the report when I read it, and I want to finish by raising the one question that the report doesn't address. What is it that we actually need to do to make our unions a place where free speech can thrive? How can we make them somewhere where everyone is respected, no matter where they come from, and no matter the colour of their lanyard?
Thank you, John. That's exactly what I was expecting. So I think we'll just come back to the floor, because I'm sure you all want to speak. So Vinay's got a microphone. He's also, I should have said earlier, actually, for those of them people joining online, and welcome to you. Sorry I didn't give a specific welcome earlier. Hundreds of Free Speech Union members are joining us online, as ever. Vinay's going to, do you think it's going to be possible to come to the Q&A box later? So do write your questions for the speakers in the Q&A box, and Vinay will read those out. You can upvote other people's questions to make it more efficient. So hands up in the room, first of all, for those who'd like to speak. There's a chap over here. You can say your name if you'd like to. If you don't want to, you don't have to, but it helps us.
Yeah, hello, my name's Steve White. I was delighted that Paul was here, because when I saw the lineup, I thought no one here is from a trade union, so I am delighted we have got that input. And I kind of agreed with what he said, because I'm from a trade union background as well. I was a local union secretary for the NEU. So just to go back to what Paul said, he said that unions have tended to adopt things like trans issues, racism as a major issue, and DEI, and woke in general, as opposed to bread and butter issues. But there is a question about why has that happened, and I think one of the reasons it's happened is because of lack of union activity and organisation and member activity. It's not the opposite. And I think what's happened, because, so if you went into my union, if you went into the 1990s, we'd have about 100 at a general meeting for an area of about 1,500 teachers. That reduced to about 30 in the early 2000s, and reduced to 15, and reduced to 10 just before COVID. And we kept on putting our, because I was the secretary at the time, and we kept on putting our quorums down. So what tended to happen then is it wasn't the general teachers who were good trade unionists, it was the kind of Trotskyist groups like the Socialist Party, Socialist Workers' Party, and other active woke people. And they adopted woke much more than trade union bread and butter stuff. One of the real problem issues that our union adopted was the trans issue. And the NEU has a definition for transphobia, which they were trying to get to be adopted by the union since about 2016. Now, why do you want a definition of that? Well, you want it so that if members fall foul of it, they can not be represented or they can lose their union membership. Now, how many have not been represented or lost their union membership? I don't know. But I fell foul of it as a local secretary representing someone who wouldn't accept that this boy at his school was a girl. And the management insisted that he had to call her her. And I said, no, he's not doing that. It's actually scientifically not so. And he has the right of free speech not to do that. He's quite happy to call the kid whatever name they want to be called. So the head teacher phones up my union, says I'm transphobic. My union get in touch with me and say, did you say this, that and the other? And I said, get lost. I'm voted in locally by members and you're not my boss. But, you know, I don't know how other people would have fared in that situation. So you have got this collaboration between head teachers and the union, paid union officials over this. And I think there's been other cases of people not being represented locally. So it's a big problem. And I think woke has replaced bread and butter issues. And we actually need to get more activists who are ordinary people and not just deluded trots and the rest to come to meetings.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, that's so part of the report does talk about this, the massive decline in union membership, which is obviously the precursor for this. Paul, did you want to come in on that? I think you're muted at the moment, but you can probably unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jan. Yeah, I mean, I agree with, I think, everything that the previous speaker said. I mean, it is certainly true that unless there are membership bases that are active and that are organised, then unions are always prone to being dominated by people with unrepresentative politics. I mean, I think that's just a statement of historical facts, actually. You know, there are a significant number of unions throughout history and even today that I think have been unduly influenced by people from the far left, the hard left, call it what you will, you know, people of a communist background, Trotskyists particularly, some of whom rise to the very top of unions, but not necessarily open about their politics because they know it won't necessarily go down well with the masses. But what it does is it allows them to get hold of the union machine and will turn the union machine towards causes and campaigns that chime with their own particular brand of unrepresentative politics, but not the view of mainstream members. Let me give you an example, a recent example in my own union, the Fire Brigades Union. The Scottish TUC recently held a conference, I think 2 months ago, for its for LGBT plus workers. They have a dedicated conference through the Scottish TUC each year. My own union, the Scottish region of the Fire Brigades Union, and this was a story that was covered by the Times and other newspapers, submitted a resolution to that conference which demanded equality for polyamorous relationships. So in terms of everything, in terms of the law, in terms of workplace law, in terms of pensions and everything else. And the resolution said something to the effect of polyamorous relationships are just as valid as monogamous relationships. Now, okay, people who believe in that are perfectly entitled to express that view and to test that argument in debate. I've got absolutely no problem with that. But that was submitted in the name of the entire Scottish region of the Fire Brigades Union. I think I can safely guarantee that the vast majority of Scottish firefighters do not believe in equality for polyamory, for polyamorous relationships. But because they weren't organised enough, and because there wasn't enough pressure on the leadership, it was an example of where a leadership is able to do things and is able to put particular views or carry out certain actions, make certain demands, because they weren't being held to account properly. I don't think there are any shortcuts to that. Going back to what the previous speaker was saying, I mean, where unions discipline people wrongly, there are certain pieces of legislation that protects members from being disciplined for certain things. So there's recourse to the certification officer or to an employment tribunal mainly. But when it comes to the political stances of trade unions, there is no substitute, frankly, for organisation and for pressure. It's only when leaderships feel that they are being held to account and that they're under pressure from a well-organised membership that they may then think twice about doing, the sort of thing that I just mentioned. So that's the key thing: organisation and pressure. It's the only way that the trade union leaderships are going to be held to account ultimately.
But then it seems like there's a catch-22, doesn't it, between the only people left in the, or not the only people, but the kind of the most vocal people and most motivated people in the unions are those with the new values, and who is going to come through and challenge them? I mean, Maurice, where the hell did these values come from? I mean, they're not. I used to balk at when kind of my tribe in the culture war, if you like, used the term progressive, because I thought, well, actually, I quite like progress. But that are these 19th century progressive values, from the 1920s? I mean, where are they from? Or are they post 60s? I mean, when did the left get into polyamory?
I mean, there's two, what do they call it? The people who like Foucault, gynecological roots to this, I think. The first is the whole issue with the Popular Front and anti-fascism in the 20s, were particularly much more powerful in those days, Trotskyists, and tried to infiltrate. So they basically, my hero is Ernest Bevin, who just told them all to fuck off. Excellent work. We actually went into alliance with the Conservative Party and actually beat Hitler, But obviously they still, everywhere there was a Popular Front, the fascists took over. It's a very important thing for me. But what they did is that they stopped calling themselves socialist, started calling themselves progressive. This was a big moment where they started to dissemble and use this word progressive. The second was obviously the 60s, the growth in the 60s of the emancipation from all limits, that this was called freedom. The student movement in the 60s will go down in history as the most ideologically stupid movement in history, where basically their whole idea of emancipation, which took the place of oppression or exploitation. Used to be that the left were against exploitation. No, now you needed to be emancipated from what? Your parents, your language, your gender. This became the leading force. Then you've got the disintegration of post-war social democratic and socialist economy, where that began. I blame Tony Crosland. So what then you have is the emergence within the Labour Party of essentially liberals, who is not enough to be a liberal, they have to be a progressive, and that means they capture state power in order to defeat racism, sexism, misogyny, and the other. So essentially you've got the decline of socialist thought and then the ascendancy of liberal thought, which is a kind of liberalism that defines freedom as the emancipation from constraint. Hence, polyamory for the Fire Brigades Union, because any constraint on individual freedom is in itself oppressive. And then, just to add with the decline of class politics, you then get third worldism, and then you get the whole idea of racism, institutional racism, systematic racism. So that becomes the credo. I mean, if you look at New Labour, it's progressive. Mm-hmm. It took over. Tony Blair is a Trotskyite. Don't ever be under any delusions about that. He wanted to see the imposition of globalization, which replaced internationalism. Do you remember? Mm-hmm. Globalization, technology and the liberation of the self from its encumbered forms of oppression.
There was also a middle class that was no closer to the working class than the one now, in the sense of the kind of anti-union, the sort of union bashing of the British middle class. Was it any better than it is now, with these kind of co-opted new middle class with sort of bohemian values rather than standard conservative values?
We used to consider middle class people to be kind of autonomous professional people, before the doctors got co-opted and all of that. So, but what you've got is this enormous growth of public sector management. But don't underestimate the extent to which this ideology, this progressive ideology, is absolutely globalist capitalist. It's divisive. It segments people into different marketing forms. So the lanyard class is the fusion of corporate private sector and corporate state sector management ideology that, if you dissent in any way from the lunacy of a certain kind of emancipatory progressive ideology, you get sacked. You see, I mean, but it's all about the decline of working class participation in working class movements. So the trade unions have been completely taken over by the lanyard class.
And so many of these kind of issues recently, where people within unions have actually fought against their unions, it's not been in the working class unions, it's been in places like UCU. So does the PMC kind of eat itself then as well? I mean,
absolutely it does. One of the strangest things about my union is, the people who are academics won't be aware of the extent to which the sector is absolutely falling apart. We've completely run out of money. And the main... And we have no power. But we tuition fees simply do not cover the costs of educating students. We've moved to teaching foreign students to try and cover the costs, and they've stopped coming. So we just have no money. People are getting sacked. And UCU last year passed 6 motions on Israel-Palestine at their Congress, and they had only 1 motion considering the question of tuition fees. The sensible suggestion, of course, is a 4.5% increase on corporation tax and a chat with Jeremy Corbyn. That is literally what they have to say about improving tuition fees. So I personally became involved in the union very much to try, and I hoped that I'd be able to, within my own branch, normalise things a little bit, move away to the issues that we care about. I was very interested in pensions. My mathematical research currently is on pensions, and I wanted to try and come up with something, with a resolution, rather than having 10 years of industrial dispute. I wanted a sensible resolution to that. And there's just no interest in that. All they're interested in is gesture politics. In fact, I've got a couple of things, because I've been telling you what's in UCU Congress's motions. I've got to tell you these that I discovered. So one motion required that Q be added to the term LGBT+ in UCU practice. And another, this is a genuine resolution of UCU Congress in 2025. They resolved that they believe woke is positive and gives voice to marginalised groups. This is what they're wasting their time with, rather than talking about our pensions, talking about our benefits. And to me, that's just complete dereliction of their job.
Okay, right, more questions. There's a chap with we've both got watches on, to the left, my left. Yeah. If you'd like to stand up, we can see you. You can choose whether or not to give your first name.
I've just sent my drink flying. That's all right. Good evening.
Yeah.
My name's Ben Green. I wanted to ask if you think part of the problem is that unions have become so large that if you take Unite Union, for example, they employ about 1,200 people. The people who work at Unite Union definitionally aren't interested in your pay and conditions as a member. They're interested in whatever they decide to get interested in and fill their days with. If the representatives of the union were the actual workers that they were supposed to be representing, rather than your lanyard class members, perhaps they would be a little bit more effective. What do you think?
Okay, John, yeah.
Well, we haven't mentioned yet my favourite union at the moment, which is the Darlington Nurses Union. I mean, they are providing one answer to the question that I'm
This is a
supposing.
new union
Yep.
set up by 4 women.
Yes, so I don't know how many members they've got, but it's barely any. But they're directly addressing the fact that nurses in Darlington had nowhere to change because they had trans women going into their changing rooms, and they're directly changing that. They took a court case. I think they've already won it. Absolutely superb. So that seems to me to give really good evidence that a smaller union is working better. But generally, I don't know the answer to this. I can look at my own union and say it's appalling. If you look at the report, UCU stands out head and shoulders above the rest as the worst union. And then it's followed by teachers' unions. They're doing appallingly. And I think we really should look at the structure of unions and see if there are patterns there for what practical things can we do to change things. I just don't know the answer. I don't think that research has been done to find out what the most practical method is, but I hope somebody takes it up.
Yeah, Maurice.
Yeah, I mean, the situation is extreme. So just to let you know, I publicly advocate there's got to be an ideological challenge to the hegemony of the progressives. That's absolutely straightforward, and that's what I do. You know, that's my day job. But certainly I would close down half the universities and turn them into vocational college. I would smash the institutions. Because all of this, I mean, a lot of the people that, progressive people, yeah, they tell me the same story. I'm from a council estate in Hounslow, but I went to university and then I started to oppress workers. And they tell it like it's a really great story about themselves. So there's got to be a real smashing of the citadels of, and universities have been incubators of generational idiocy. We've got to look at this. I think absolutely. So not just closed down. I think there's got to be purges in the university. Like Cromwell had a purge in 1648. He went into Cambridge, got rid of half the academics. Within 30 years, they had Newton. You know, he said they'd fallen below the level expected of scientific research. I like that. What I was thinking, we could talk about it, is getting cancelled academics, retired academics who know what the integrity of an academic life should be. Because what the unions have gone into partnership is to proletarianize academics, to destroy any sense of power, status, honor, dignity. Daily life is a humiliation, right? Of emails and you know, evaluations. Have you had those? You know, like, oh, you're very good, yeah. And then this. So universities restored as self-governing institutions. I mean, really and truly, there shouldn't be an academic union. I mean, there should be a guild of some kind there, because they're pretending to be working class. That's another thing about academics. It's really irritating. The guy in my university, fantastic name, I've got to say it publicly, Cliff Snaith. You didn't need to really know any more about that. And so all these areas, human resource departments need to be eliminated. I think curriculum and development departments should be humiliated, and absolutely restore the union role, collective bargaining. That's the role of a union, is collective bargaining, and direct election of workers onto the boards. But it can't be mediated by the unions anymore, because if you did that, there would be another layer of the lanyard class exerting control over anything other than industry, production and wages. You know, those are the essential matters. So, and then it gets back to the old issue, which Paul and I have talked about, is the complete elimination of trade union organising. You know, building relationships, building a strong identity within the union, and developing leaders from the working class, which now it's all PPE graduates or equivalent, you know. And I'm just talking about the Parliamentary Labour Party. You know, there's about 4 people who've had a job. You know, they're literally no idea about, and so they've got to where they've got by exactly your Vice-Chancellor. They don't believe this shit, but they go along with that, and it's actually been a a fanatical cadre, but that fanatical cadre of progressives have absolutely got to be taken out, lose their jobs, eliminated, purged. I mean, that's where we are now, because otherwise the unions and the universities will have no integrity, no structure, and will be just agents of eternal thought police.
On that note, let's go out to the floor again. So we'll take a couple. Sorry, Vinay, if we don't mind doing down the front and then the chat behind. If we could, we'll be a little bit quicker now, and then we'll try and then we'll go to the Q&A after these two. I'd like to say.
Thank you very much. Just to your point there, Lord Glassman, you said they don't believe this shit. I just wonder, listening to what you're saying, do you think these views are honestly and genuinely held, or are they just the means to corral and control and achieve power and exercise power? Do you think? What's the question?
No, we'll go, then the chap in the blue jacket, and then Vinay, if we can go to the Q&A, thank you.
Isn't the problem that the union, I mean, the title was Trade Unions Today. There are no trades. So the unions are now anarchic. I mean, they're out of date. They are all professionals. Most of the members of most unions have degrees. They are the administrative class. They're not the workers any longer. They may work. We talk a lot about unions in universities, in schools, in bureaucracies, in the public sector. But when the idea of unions came around, it was about real workers in industry. But there's no industry. So the unions are like anybody else. They've been captured entirely by the progressives, as you say, just like any other institution, like the civil service, health workers, you name it. Everyone's in this same problem of society having been captured by these progressives. And there's nothing new about it, and the unions are not unique in that way. So the unions need to think about who are really their members, and it ought to be people in doing Deliveroo or call centres or whatever, not academics and so on, because they are the professionals.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take one from the Q&A.
Yeah.
There's an obvious one that's been upvoted.
Yeah, I think that's quite a good one about turnout in elections. And in the union elections, someone's put the UCU turnout is currently something like 10%. So would this problem be solved if union members actually started to vote or not in union elections?
Okay, thank you. Do you guys want to, John, do you want to come back?
Well, I may as well go in on that one about 10% turnout. I think this is part of the deliberate tactic within UCU, is to just absolutely repel everybody from taking any interest in the union whatsoever. It's just embarrassing to hear people going on and, about these crazy niche political issues. Of course, people become uninterested, and of course they don't vote. So yes, absolutely, if we could get a higher turnout than 10%, that would sort things out. But it's a very, very deliberate tactic on the part of the activists to make people lose all interest in participating. And another trick they've used is just straightforward gerrymandering. I don't agree that just because I'm middle class means that I don't need representation. I've got real issues at work. But where I do see a problem is that PhD students are my customers. They are not academics, and yet they actually get free 4 years membership in UCU, which means that there's a huge domination of PhD students voting, which means that there's very little representation of academics at all. So I think we really need to reform how voting takes place and get away from this system of all decisions being made at Congress and democratise things further.
Well, and the other thing it made me think of is these cases, which I think, Paul, you can correct me, yours falls into this category where the union executive discipline an elected representative. So I think in your case, initially you went to employment tribunal as an employee, and then eventually in an appeal, it was decided that no, you didn't have a case because you were not an employee after all, you were an elected representative. And I know we've got other cases where similar things have happened in other professional organisations like the police and elsewhere. Is that accurate?
Yeah, broadly. I mean, I won't bore you with all of the details, but essentially, yes, I was a member of the Executive Council. I was disciplined by the Executive Council. I appealed to the Union's National Conference. My appeal was rejected. I won at first instance an employment tribunal claim for unfair dismissal, but that was overturned on appeal, simply on a technicality that the union argued that, even though I was working for them full time at the time, I'd been seconded from my main job in the fire brigade, and technically I wasn't an employee of the union. There were fairly strong arguments on both sides regarding that, but I think most people at the end of that process saw that regardless of the technicalities, that an injustice had been dealt morally. I think most people saw it that way. Can I just touch on something that I think John just said? Reference turnouts and the question around turnouts, and I think much of what John just said is relevant, but we at the same time we can't ignore the fact that when it comes to things like electing general secretaries, taking strike action, the law since the 1980s, thanks to Norman Teviot and Margaret Thatcher, has largely been designed to make turnouts as low as possible. So even now, for example, in this day and age of the internet and e-voting and all sorts of things, you can't vote for a general secretary electronically. You literally still, under the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act 1992, you still have to put your cross in a physical hard copy ballot form, put it in an envelope, take it down to the post box and post it. I don't know of any other industry or any other walk of life where there's no facility to be able to vote electronically on decisions as major as that. And there's no doubt that has had and continues to have an effect. There's a compelling case for saying that people should be allowed to vote electronically, and that would undoubtedly increase turnout. And if I can really just briefly, Jen, I just wanted to come back on a previous point about super unions and about the disappearance of industrial unions and so on. I'm fascinated by British trade union history, and it's very true that there used to be a huge number of industrial unions, quite often small industrial unions, with the most wonderful names. I've got a picture of my late father-in-law's union card from, I think it was the 1960s, and he was a member of the National Union of Sheet Metal Workers, Coppersmiths and Heating and Domestic Engineers. That was actually a thing. That was actually a trade union. And when you look at that era, there are trade unions with very kind of similar names. They were very specific. They were very industry focused. And there's no doubt, in my view, that the kind of advent of super unions has without question been a bad thing, because with super unions you get super bureaucracies and you get leaderships that are increasingly out of touch with their members, and where members are less and less able to exert control, where democracy internally becomes very tenuous. So that, without question, for me, has been a detrimental thing for the movement.
Okay, let's go back out to the floor. So there's a woman down here. And I can see Shell. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Maria. I think that it is...
Maria, speak right into the mic. Yeah.
It is quite evident from the talk that we had today from all of our amazing speakers and the conversations and the questions here that we're having, that the unions are infiltrated by the lanyard class, managerial elites, as with any other institution like schools, higher education, teachers, the managers in NHS here, they're in all professions. So as with all other institutions, the question is, can we restore the existing unions that we have, or we need to go from the scratch? As we have to do with the schools, as we have to do with higher education. In the United States, they are creating new universities. Here we have, I think, it's only the University of Buckingham that has the Center for Heterodox Social Science, that it's moving towards this direction. But probably I think this is what the FCU is doing here. So we need something new, probably. Can we restore? Can we really get rid of those progressive elites, those people who have infiltrated the unions and any other institution, or we just need to expand and go from the scratch. And maybe this is a question for the Free Speech Union. If the current structure can accommodate the volume of incidents and of members, or maybe you should start thinking, creating more branches that specializing in education, like to replace the teachers' union, NHS to replace the current unions there, trade professions, higher education. I don't know, maybe it's just a thought what we are doing with that. I think this is my view, that we need to go from the scratch. I don't think that we can really restore the existing unions that we have or other institutions. We cannot get rid of them that easily, probably.
Well, that's the question that comes up whichever institution, as you said, we're discussing, whether that's education, universities, or anything at the moment. I'm just, Vinay, if you can go to Michelle in the hat.
Michelle Shipworth, another academic. And apologies if I get some of the legalities of this sort of slightly squiffed, because I don't understand it properly. But my understanding is that trade unions have certain rights to be in the room for certain discussions, certain meetings, and some of that is accorded to them by legislation or workplace rules, etc. Arguably, it's that setup that has actually put union leaders in a position where they can effectively use that power to cajole the workers into particular beliefs, etc., or saying that they have certain beliefs and certain practices, etc. Is there a danger if there's another group of organisations like free speech unions? Is there a danger that if such organisations are given similar powers, that could similarly end up being abused down the track?
And also, people should remember that we only represent people on speech issues. I know people often want us to represent them on everything, but free speech is what we do. So other things are going to have to spring up to represent different interests. Mike with the waistcoat. Thanks.
Oh, hi. My name is Macvarish. I think I'm fairly embourgeoisie now, but I do come from a council house on the eastern edge of Preston. My dad was a low-paid council worker, and I'm probably the only person in this room who's actually worked, even if only for a couple of weeks, as a student, as a dustbin man. So I do know a bit about the working class life. A couple of things. The point has been made that the unions are permeated by this so-called lanyard class, the same as everybody else. But really, it's hardly a surprise, because when you look at the history of the whole trade union and labour movement, this tension between practical campaigning for improving conditions and utopianism has been there right from the start, and you can follow it way through the 19th century. There's nothing particular to Great Britain about that either. In the late 19th, early 20th century, Lenin rather sniffily observed that left to themselves the working class can only develop a trades union consciousness, and if you continue through the 20th century, the same thing can be followed right through. And the crucial time, I think that hasn't been mentioned here, is the mid-80s and the miners' strike, because that was the last time there was an attempt to use the unions as a blunt object to if you like, batter the state into submission. If anyone can remember, the phrase that used to be used was the stormtroopers of the working class. A funny phrase for people who often describe themselves as anti-fascists. And after that, we got the development of this new type of politics in which the working class, which formerly was idolised, became the white working class to be despised, and the masses were replaced by the minorities. And if you look at what's happening now, it's really no surprise, because in actual fact, as I said right at the start, the trade union and labour movement has always had this dichotomy right from the start, and it's a surprise it's taking so long for this to happen.
Interesting. So, I mean, is this part of just a very, very long-standing trend, really, that's working its way out?
Yeah, and this comes back to my objection to the progress thing that you like, is that linear time, progress is linear time, but I take circular time. There's ups and downs and formations of new things. which are also old things. So just to go back to the point earlier, unless you get 50% turnout, the election should be void, right? That's just, unless 50% of the members vote, you go again. It's just, this is just classic preying on disintegrating institutions and capturing them. I think that's a completely legitimate condition for the state to lay down. But this is a really interesting point. See, I don't see the distinction between paying conditions on the one side and utopianism on the other. I think the Fabians are evil people. They believed in eugenics. Look what we had in Parliament last week, 9-month abortion and killing old people. Very Fabian. That's a very middle class thing. Kill babies and old people, but promote the lanyard class, I think, would be their general ideological position. What you had in the labour movement was an attempt to retrieve the human status of the person from the inhumanity of capitalism. It wasn't just paying conditions, it was the dignity of work. And in all that, Paul, was vocation and vocational training and expertise and mastery. So we've got to have a very, very conservative mind and think through we live in an age of restoration. You may all hate me for it, but I was invited to Trump's inauguration and I was astounded by this fact that I never really put Make America Great Again. I never understood this emphasis on the again. That was in MAGA rallies, they just throw their lanyards in the bin. That's what's happening it was a working class insurrection precisely against the professional managerial class. And so what I'm saying is I can't see you, but that was a really interesting intervention. It wasn't that the working class was divided between those who upheld the dignity of labour and those who always wanted state control over this and to move in that way. And so worker conditions was always time that the greatest disaster was Unite itself. The T&G, Ernest Bevin's union, had very strong shop steward representation, very interesting relationships with in-house training and apprenticeship. That's all gone out the window. So I do see the possibility of restoration, but it's got to be a built around knowledge and particular expertise. So, for example, a guild of mathematical academics, and you negotiate paying conditions within that framework.
But do you think, are we really going to see, it's very hard to see how we were going to get a return to the collective, given the conditions of the way the vast majority of people are working, so the kind of casualisation of labour, etc., the importing of labour. So one thing that occurred to me when I was thinking about this was when it comes down to freedom of speech itself. There seems to be a bit of a pat thing where people say, well, free speech was always a value of the left. But actually, I don't know whether free speech does coexist very easily with the collective, because free speech has got a very strong individual kind of aspect to it as well.
So, for example, just if we're going to get into this, I hate all forms of rights. I like liberty. Right, and the ancient liberties. We had 4 in the ancient constitution. Liberty, freedom of association. That's what the whole trade union thing was. We weren't allowed to organise ourselves. We got deported to bloody Australia for actually organising trade unions. Freedom of association, freedom of expression. That's your free speech thing. Freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. These are the ancient liberties. But when you get to rights, then it becomes all our victories are now legal. I can't stand it. It shouldn't be decided that a man is a woman or a woman is a man in the court. It should be democratically elected politicians who make that decision in Parliament. This is political. We've got to restore politics and reject the sovereignty of the law. So my argument to you is that liberty was a huge thing in the trade union movement, the capacity to express yourself and to organize yourselves without interference or coercion from outside. That was the whole thing.
But wasn't there also an immense pressure, and I'm saying this to just as kind of devil's advocate really, but an immense pressure of the collective on the individual. So to the extent that that's what's going on now, where you have...
My point to you is that they weren't organised as a collective. they were organised as associations. And within the association, you came to a corporate decision within that, where exactly, look at the records of the old guilds and the old trade unions when they formed. If you look at the records, it's punctiliously recorded the debates that were had, and I can find no example of expulsion within that. But they were associations. It wasn't the mass. Precisely, they had human scale organisations, which was destroyed by super unions and all this.
But yeah, okay. I don't want to dominate things. Yeah. So, Vinay, is there anything else from the Q&A?
Yeah, there's one that's very popular about the case of Sandra Peggy. Would the panel like to comment on / attempt to explain the lack of union support for Sandra Peggy, if you guys know what that's about?
So that's the nurse in Scotland who was disciplined for challenging the presence of a trans person in her changing room, and her case is ongoing, isn't it? When's it coming?
Well, it started this week. I've been absolutely looking forward to it for months. I'm going to be glued to watching Naomi Cunningham. I think she may rip people apart. No, I mean, that case, it just brings us straight to the Darlington Nurses Union. That they are essentially responding to exactly the same issue, but in the correct way. Unite's behaviour in not supporting Sandy Paggy was appalling. And this takes us to where we were with the Free Speech Union, saying that all they can defend is people's free speech rights. That's what they're interested in. So the right not to be subjected to indecent exposure at work is something that Free Speech Union can't defend. But it's something that, clearly unions should be defending people from. And so really it's a symptom of a wider malaise in unions that they're limiting free speech. There are many other problems that are getting ignored and that people can't speak about.
Thank you.
Unite should just change their name to Divide the Union, and that will clarify exactly where the greatest, most democratic free trade union in the whole history of the world, the Transport General Workers, are now that. And it's a matter of huge shame to them and to us, but they have to absolutely be challenged in all this aspect.
Do you guys think that the right needs to stop bashing the unions in the way it once did? I mean, so there's a lot of kind of anti-union sentiment amongst the right, which is based on the kind of Thatcher period, and does the right need to in the same way you're saying the left needs to rethink itself on values and representing working people, does the right also need to revisit its own kind of heightened individualism of the 80s? Well, there's a chap at the back, maybe we can think about that later on.
Good evening, my name is Andrew. Quick potted history. I was a professional engineer. I'm now not any longer. I actually work in a manual position. One of the things that you haven't covered, and I will cover your point, Jan, in a minute, is that you've polarised and majored onto the lanyard classes. You also need to remember and look at the other end of the spectrum and at the manual classes. There are still those around, they do still exist. And there's two very, very large unions. One is the GMB and the other is USDOR. And you haven't mentioned those. You've majored on the academics, you've majored on the local councils, you've majored on large institutions, and those are just as large and they exist in private industry. And people are suffering, and I thoroughly came along tonight to hopefully hear about proposals for free speech and for the FSU to represent us in union negotiations where disciplinaries are involved. It's not just the sole preserve of UCU and BEC2 and others. It does happen exactly at the opposite end of the spectrum. But going back to your point, does the right need to stop bashing? The right has turned round and taken this on themselves for the simple reason that the left has turned round and been hijacked by Marxists and Trotskyists. So they've infiltrated the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party. They've turned round and put that down as PLP policy. It's gone through to the unions, and the unions turn round and bash their members at local level, especially in the large super unions, which are not UCU, it's not BEC2, it's not the others at the end of the scale. Yes, it might be the Civil Service Union, but it's USDOR, and it's the GMB, and it's Unite, and that's where the numbers exist. And you haven't touched on that tonight.
Thank you. I'll let Maurice come back on that because we're going to sort of sum up in just a moment. Toby, did you have anything to say about the particular recommendations? Maurice is holding it against you that he's hearing you words.
Hi.
I don't want to land you, but as you've just walked in, but we haven't really gone on to the recommendations of the report yet.
Right. I'd just like to say I'm sorry I wasn't here for the panel discussion, which I was very much looking forward to, but delighted that John and Maurice and Jan are here. The reason I wasn't here is because the debate about Clause 20 of the Employment Rights Bill, which we branded the banter ban, was happening. And I had to be there to defend my amendments. Unfortunately, we lost the vote on the first of those amendments by 30 votes. The Lib Dems all filed into the not content lobby along with the government. And so we were defeated, but we fight on. And there will be some more opportunities to amend the Employment Rights Bill. And one of the ways in which we can try and amend it is to make it possible for workers to be represented in workplace disputes, not just by the trade unions they're dues-paying members of, but by other professional organisations like the Free Speech Union. And that is the recommended solution in the trade union report, that we have to broaden the number of people that, or the range of people and organisations that workers who find themselves in workplace disputes can be represented by. Because if you find yourself being investigated for a disciplinary offence for having breached a workplace speech code, as I'm sure you've heard tonight, in all probability, particularly if it's to do with sex and gender, your union is unlikely to defend you. So I think that means it really is critically important that people who find themselves in that situation do have access to other organisations, legal help that can defend them.
Thanks, Toby. So the report will go up. It's not on the website yet, is it, Toby? So I think it will go up in the next couple of days.
Yes, it's not up yet.
No, I think it was waiting for your final sign.
Okay.
But that it will go up, and we'll obviously be tweeting about it when it's up. It will be in the newsletter, so you can go and find it, and we'll put it in the link to the video if anybody wants to rewatch this event. So I will we've only got the bar until 9:30, so I'm suggesting that we wrap up very quickly with a couple of final comments from each speaker, and then we stick around and you can be here till about 9:45. So I can't remember which order now we've spoken. Let's go to Paul first. Paul, did you have any sort of final comments?
Thank you, Jan. It's been a really interesting discussion, actually, with some really thought-provoking contributions from the floor. So thank you to you and to the Free Speech Union for putting on what I think has been a really good event. Simply to say, to kind of follow on from my contribution earlier, that I think this is, it's easy to overdo these things, but I think this genuinely is one of the kind of critical battles of our age, actually, not just in the workplace, but I think wider society, where we are increasingly, as a society, subject to a growing web of restrictive laws on what we can say and when we can say it, and when we can't say it. And those laws out there in wider society are complemented, if that's the right word, by HR directives, with sprawling HR departments, which are now enforcing speech codes in a way that I don't think I've ever seen. I went out to work at 16 years of age, in 1991 or whatever it is, and I don't think I've ever seen such a tightening grip and such an oppressive grip, frankly, on workers and what they can and can't do, and their liberties to be able to argue their point of view and say what they believe is right. So from that point of view, it's crucial. And I think the FSU, to its great credit, is making a lot of the running on this, and hopefully will bring other unions along, because they have been conspicuous by their absence in many of these debates and many of these campaigns. And lots of workers have paid the price. And will go on paying the price unless they really step up to the plate. So it's a crucial battle, and the trade unions, I think, need to call on the movement's history, proud history of defending workers in the workplace, arguing for diversity of thought, for the widest possible debate, even over contentious issues. That was once part of the movement's DNA. It isn't anymore, and it needs to be again. And I'm very happy to be part of that battle. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks, Paul. John, final thoughts.
So I just wanted to go to the recommendations, which is that people should be able to be represented by groups like the FSU. I just want to comment on how impossible it is for a worker to go to an employment meeting faced by their bosses without any support at all. It's a horrific experience. I've been through it myself, and to know that there's somebody on your side means everything. In response to Michelle's question of whether or not perhaps that power to accompany people is in itself problematic, I think the real problem is that at the moment unions have the power to withhold that representation from people. And that's another form of control that they can impose over you, to limit your thought, knowing that you're a persona non grata and will no longer have any employment representation. Is a horrific feeling. So I strongly endorse the approach of widening who can represent you. I think it'll make a big difference.
Great, thank you, John. Maurice, final comment.
Yeah, just good work, but we've got to go further. I mean, the liberties come together: freedom of expression, freedom of religion. There's much more coercion now, and more coercion accepted. Freedom of expression, freedom of conscience is vital, and above all, freedom of association. This attempt they all go together, but above all, I just say, don't lose faith in the people and in democracy. All this bullshit is going to get very soundly rejected very, very soon. And I think we should all delight in that prospect.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our speakers. And thank you very much to those who joined online. I'm going to say goodbye to you now, so we'll cut the live stream, and bye-bye. Thank you. See you next time.